It's a Friday night in 1969, the sun just dropped behind the trees, and somewhere in a small town parking lot, an engine cracks to life with a sound like thunder deciding to stay a while. Heads turn. Conversations stop mid-sentence. A teenager leans against a light pole trying to look casual, but everyone knows exactly what that sound means. Something fast just arrived, and for the next few hours, nothing else in town matters quite as much. That sound, that specific rumble of American V8 horsepower rolling through small town streets, wasn't just noise. It was the soundtrack of a generation figuring out who they were, and it came wrapped in steel, chrome, and just enough danger to make it irresistible. To understand why muscle cars became so much more than transportation, you have to understand what America looked like in the years right before they showed up. The country was climbing out of the quiet conformity of the 1950s. Post-war prosperity had given families television sets, backyard barbecues, and a growing sense that tomorrow would always be better than today. But teenagers born into that comfort were starting to want something their parents never had, a way to announce that they were their own people, with their own rules, their own music, and their own definition of freedom. Detroit was paying attention. Automakers realized that this new generation had money in their pockets from part-time jobs, and more importantly, they had appetite. Not for practical sedans built to haul groceries and get good gas mileage, but for something loud, something fast, something that felt like rebellion you could legally drive off a dealership lot. So in 1964, when a scrappy little car with a big engine and a small body rolled into showrooms, it wasn't just a new model. It was a spark landing on dry grass. That car changed everything, and within a couple of years, every major manufacturer wanted in. Suddenly showroom floors were filled with machines built around a simple, almost reckless idea: take a mid-sized, affordable car, and stuff the biggest engine you can fit under the hood. Forget subtlety. Forget restraint. The goal was raw power, wrapped in a body cheap enough that a young factory worker or a college kid with a summer job could actually save up and drive one home. And that affordability mattered more than people often remember today. Muscle cars weren't exotic dream machines reserved for the wealthy. They were attainable. A hard-working teenager could realistically set a goal, save every paycheck, and within a year or two, park one of these beasts in the driveway. That accessibility is part of what made the culture explode the way it did. This wasn't a fantasy limited to magazine pages. It was a promise that felt within reach. Once these cars hit the streets, something interesting happened. They didn't just become vehicles, they became identity. If you drove a certain badge, people made assumptions about who you were before you even said a word. There was a language spoken in engine displacement numbers, in exhaust notes, in the particular whine of a 4-speed manual being pushed through its gears. Owning one of these cars said something about your values, your swagger, your willingness to take a risk. It separated you from the crowd in a way that felt almost tribal, and where identity forms, community follows. Small towns and big cities alike developed unofficial gathering spots, usually a drive-in restaurant with a big parking lot, or a stretch of road just outside town limits where cars could line up side by side under the glow of headlights. These spots became sacred ground for teenagers navigating that strange, thrilling stretch of life between childhood and adulthood. You'd hear engines revving, tires occasionally chirping, and underneath it all, a constant hum of conversation, laughter, and the particular electricity that comes from being young and free on a warm night with nowhere you have to be. Racing, of course, was inevitable. Not the kind with grandstands and official rulebooks, but the kind whispered about at school on Monday morning. Two cars pulling up next to each other at a stoplight, a nod exchanged, and then a burst of noise and rubber as they took off down a straight stretch of road. These impromptu contests weren't really about the quarter mile. They were about proving something, about earning a kind of respect that couldn't be bought, only one behind the wheel. Reputations were built and lost in a matter of seconds, and the stories from those nights got told and retold for years afterward, growing a little more legendary with each telling. What made this whole era even more remarkable was the sheer creativity flowing out of Detroit during this stretch. Automakers were locked in a horsepower arms race, each trying to outdo the last, cramming bigger engines into smaller bodies, chasing bragging rights on the street and on the sales floor. New names kept appearing, each one trying to capture lightning in a bottle, each one hoping to become the car that defined the era. And for a few golden years, it felt like the sky was the limit. Bigger engines. Louder exhaust notes. Bolder colors. Wilder stripes running down the hood. It was automotive design as personal expression, and an entire generation was living out its youth in the driver's seat. But muscle cars weren't just about speed and swagger. They carried an emotional weight too, tied up in memory, in first loves, in long summer nights that felt endless at the time and impossibly short in hindsight. Ask anyone who came of age during this period, and you'll often hear the same kind of story. A first date in the passenger seat, windows down, radio turned up just enough to hear over the engine. A graduation night spent cruising familiar streets one last time before everyone scattered toward different futures. A father teaching a son or daughter how to properly rev an engine without flooding it, passing down not just mechanical knowledge but a piece of cultural inheritance. These cars became woven into some of the most formative moments of people's lives, which is exactly why the memory of them still stirs something powerful decades later. There was also something deeply democratic about the whole culture, at least in terms of who could participate in the conversation, if not always in who could afford to own one outright. You didn't need money to appreciate these machines. You needed eyes and ears. Kids who could never scrape together enough for a down payment still knew every detail, every engine option, every subtle styling change from one model year to the next. Magazines devoted entire issues to comparing performance numbers. Neighborhood garages became informal classrooms where teenagers learned to change spark plugs, adjust carburetors, and diagnose engine trouble by sound alone. This wasn't just about owning a car. It was about belonging to something bigger, a shared enthusiasm that cut across neighborhoods and social circles. Of course, nothing gold stays that way forever. By the early 1970s, the world was shifting under the wheels of these machines. Insurance companies started raising premiums on high-performance models, recognizing what every teenager already instinctively knew, that these cars were built to be driven fast and sometimes recklessly. Stricter emissions regulations began creeping into engine design, trading raw horsepower for compliance with new environmental standards. And then came the oil crisis, sending gas prices soaring and making the idea of a car that guzzled fuel just to prove a point feel suddenly impractical, even irresponsible. One by one, the engines got smaller. The horsepower numbers that once seemed to climb without limit started retreating instead. The wild, unrestrained era of chasing pure performance for its own sake began fading into something more cautious, more calculated. For the generation that had come of age during those peak years, it felt like watching a piece of their youth quietly disappear in the rearview mirror. But here's the thing about culture built on genuine emotion. It doesn't just vanish because circumstances change. It goes dormant, waiting for the right moment to resurface. And resurface it did, again and again, in the decades that followed. Collectors began seeking out surviving examples, restoring them not just mechanically but almost spiritually, treating each rebuild like an act of preservation for something meaningful. Car shows sprang up specifically dedicated to this era, drawing crowds of people who wanted to stand next to these machines one more time, to hear that engine note again, to feel transported back to a specific summer night decades in the past. Even people too young to have experienced the original era firsthand found themselves drawn in, captivated by photographs, by stories passed down from parents and grandparents, by something that felt more authentic and more alive than much of what modern car culture offers. So why did these cars leave such a permanent mark on an entire generation? Part of the answer is timing. They arrived at exactly the moment when young Americans were hungry for a symbol of independence, and Detroit happened to be building exactly that symbol, wrapped in sheet metal and horsepower. Part of it is accessibility, the fact that these weren't distant fantasies but real, attainable machines that ordinary teenagers could actually work toward owning. And part of it is simply the emotional residue that gets attached to anything present during the most formative years of a person's life. First loves. First real freedom. First taste of an identity chosen rather than assigned. Muscle cars gave a generation something to rally around, something loud enough to announce their arrival into adulthood and distinctive enough to feel like it belonged to them alone. They turned ordinary parking lots into gathering places, turned quiet streets into stages, and turned an entire era of American youth into something that still echoes every time one of those engines fires up at a car show or cruises slowly down Main Street on a warm summer evening. And maybe that's the real secret behind why this culture never truly faded. It was never really about the cars themselves, not entirely. It was about what they represented: freedom, identity, connection, and the particular thrill of being young at exactly the right moment in history. The engines have quieted with age, and many of the original owners have grown old alongside their machines. But every time that distinctive rumble echoes down a street today, it carries all of that history with it, a direct line back to a generation that found its voice, quite literally, under the hood.